Chapter 8. The Accident. Lydia's mum wheeled the trolley back to the car, followed by Danny, and last of all Lydia. They each picked up a carrier bag and started loading up the boot of the car. "Mum, I want to walk home," said Lydia when their dawn was finished. "Why? You're always telling me to get more fresh air and exercise," Lydia snapped. "Well, that's what I want to do." Mum frowned. "Fine, you go for your walk, and maybe by the time you get home you'll have walked the devil out your backside." Danny laughed as he always did whenever Mum used that expression. Mum's lips twitched reluctantly. "As my mother used to say," she added dryly. It was strange how Mum always quoted Lydia's gran when she was annoyed. The ghost of a smile that flitted across Lydia's face was gone as quickly as it arrived. "Can I go?" Lydia asked, forcing herself not to snap or snarl or scowl. "Go on then," Mum said. "Get walking. Just arrive back when you're in a better mood." With a brief nod of gratitude, Lydia headed across the car park. To get to the car park exit wasn't the easiest thing in the world. It was uphill all the way. "Lydia, don't cut across the car park. Go through the supermarket. It's safer," Mum called after her. Lydia shook her head. "I'll be okay," she called back. No way did she want to see Anne and Frankie again. "Mind the cars," Mum warned. Lydia nodded and carried on walking. "I must be crazy," she muttered to herself. It would be a long walk home, especially in the freezing cold, but at least it gave her a chance to be alone and think. The car park was busy with cars coming to and from the supermarket. But although Lydia was careful to watch out for the approaching cars, she was oblivious to everything else. She had too many other things on her mind. "Think, Lydia, think," she told herself sternly. How had Anne done it? How had Anne set her up? How would I plant something in someone else's locker, Lydia was? Spy on them for a while, and then when they opened their locker, try and get the combination? No, that wouldn't work. Anne needed eyes like a hawk to be able to work out Lydia's locker combination from any sort of distance. And if Anne had been close enough to see what it was, then Lydia would be certain she would have seen her. Unless Anne had used binoculars? Lydia stopped walking and frowned. Binoculars, was that it? Lydia shook her head and carried on walking. Surely someone would have spotted Anne bringing binoculars to school. Besides, it was an awful lot of effort to go and just get someone into trouble. But why not? Maybe Anne reckoned that getting Lydia in trouble and getting Frankie back as her best friend at the same time would be worth the risk. Lydia's left foot slipped on a patch of ice. She stepped gingerly across it and carried on walking. The sooner she was out of the car park and away from Anne and Frankie and everyone else, the better. "That's all I need, to slip and trip, skate along on my bum all the way back down to Sainsbury's," Lydia thought sourly. She smiled slowly. Maybe that wasn't such a bad idea. She broke her arm or a leg, and she'd be off school for a while, as long as she didn't break her neck first. On second thought, maybe it wasn't such a good idea after all. "Lydia, hang on! Didn't you hear me calling after you?" Lydia turned. Frankie came puffing uphill towards her. Lydia glared at her but said nothing. So much for wanting to be alone, to walk home and think. She only made it as far as the car park exit. When Frankie reached Lydia, she looked around nervously, then tentatively smiled. Lydia's face remained a frozen mask. Frankie's attempt at a smile faded to nothing. "I want to talk to you." "Why?" asked Lydia. Her voice was icier than the weather. "So you can rub it in about how Anne set me up. And I bet you had more than a little to do with it." Lydia's eyes narrowed at the thought. "You know Anne did it?" Frankie asked, astonished. "I'm not stupid, you know," Lydia asked. "I didn't put that stinking cup in the locker. It doesn't take a genius to guess who did." "Listen, Lydia, I'm on your side. I want to help you." "Yeah, right," Lydia scoffed. "I do," Frank insisted. "That's why you told Anne where to go just now in the supermarket, right? That's why you've stood up for me over the past week when everyone's been calling me names," said Lydia bitterly. "I couldn't say anything." "Of course you couldn't," Lydia scorned. "If you'll just listen to me." Frankie put her hand on Lydia's arm. Lydia slapped it away, pulling back on Frankie at the same time. Frankie's feet slipped on the patch of ice beneath her. Her arms shot out and spun around like a windmill. Then the whole world slowed down into the slowest motion, as Lydia watched, horrified. Frankie started falling backwards. Lydia took a step towards her, but it was as if she was wading through thick treacle. It was as if time itself was running so slowly that it was almost at a standstill. Except that Lydia could see and understand everything that was happening. Her brain was running at normal speed, but her body wasn't. Frankie took a desperate step backwards into the road to steady herself, her arms still flailing. Lydia put out her hand to grab hold of Frankie's coat, but her fingers missed it by millimetres, and Frankie carried on falling. Lydia moved forward to grab Frankie, but she was too late. The driver of the oncoming car turning into the car park tried to swerve out of the way, but couldn't do it in time. The front of his car smacked into Frankie. There was a sickening thud, and Frankie spun round like a top before sinking to the ground. Then time speeded up, and everything happened at once. The screech of the brakes, footsteps running, someone screaming, more people shouting. The sound came from all around, and Lydia stood and stared at Frankie, who lay in a crumpled heap on the road. Do something, do something, the voice in Lydia's head screamed over and over. I couldn't help it. She came out of nowhere. The driver of the car stumbled out of the car. He was a tank of a man, easily over 2 meters high, and built like an American footballer. But he stood over Frankie, rocking back and forth, his eyes huge and unblinking. She came out of nowhere. His voice trembled as he spoke. It wasn't my fault. She came out of nowhere. No, don't move her. It's dangerous to do that, some middle-aged woman who came running up. Someone phoned for an ambulance. What happened? Get the police. Is she badly hurt? The questions annoyed the people in the car park. They all faded out by the replaced roar of Lydia's blood rushing to her ears. You pushed her. I saw you. You pushed her. At the sound of Anne's voice, Lydia spun round. With slow dawning shock, she realised that Anne was pointing at her. Lydia pushed her. I saw it. She and Frankie were arguing. I ran over here to help, and Lydia's hand went out. She pushed her, screamed Anne. Lydia gasped as she had been kicked in the stomach. She couldn't have said a word if her very life had depended on it. Her tongue was frozen in her mouth. In fact, her whole body had gone numb. She pushed her. I saw it. Anne was still pointing at her, hatred blazing on her face. I didn't. Lydia's voice was almost a non-existent whisper. I was trying to grab her, to stop her from falling. She looked around. Those people who weren't attending to Frankie were watching her, without saying a word. Lydia closed her eyes. She was back in the playground, surrounded by the others in her year, who watched her and called her name. She opened her eyes again. Grown-ups were all around her, surrounding her and silently watching. Lydia, what's going on? Lydia's mum came running up. Then she saw Frankie lying on the road, still as a grave. Oh my God, Lydia's mum breathed. I didn't do it, Mum, Lydia exclaimed desperately. It was an accident. She... Before Lydia could say another word, sirens sounded in the distance, getting closer and closer. Mum, shh. Mum came and stood beside her, as did Annie. She came out of nowhere. The driver of the car was still staring at Frankie, who hadn't moved a millimetre since she'd been hit. The ambulance arrived within moments. Could you all stand back, please, said a paramedic, trying to push his way through the crowd. Everyone moved out of his way. Once through, the paramedic immediately crouched down beside Frankie. He and the woman who'd been driving the ambulance listened as Anne's mother told them what had happened, even though she'd only just arrived herself. Her name is Frances Weldon. She goes to school with my daughter. The man over there knocked her over, but it was an accident. The driver's skin was like tracing paper. I'll look after him, said the other paramedic. She went over to the driver and linked his arm with her own. Come on, sir. Let's get you to the hospital, she said softly, leading the way to the ambulance. Mum, what's wrong with him? Danny whispered. He's in shock, Mum replied grimly. Lydia's heart was lodged somewhere in her throat, slowly choking her as the paramedic carefully examined Frankie. The pain in her chest grew sharper and more intense until, with a start, she realised that she'd been holding her breath. She expelled the air in her lungs a tiny bit at a time. Is Frankie okay? Anne's mum asked the paramedic. I don't know. We'll know more once we've got her to the hospital, the paramedic replied. Could you follow us so we can get some details and contact her parents? His colleague came back and helped her carry Frankie's prone body into the ambulance on a stretcher. Lydia didn't take her eyes off Frankie. Even when the ambulance doors were shut behind her, Lydia still couldn't look away. I saw what you did, and you're not going to get away with it. Anne's voice rang out loud and clear like a bell. Lydia turned her head, and Anne stood in front of her mother, each of them a mirror of the other. I feel sorry for you, Anne Turner. Have you really got nothing better to do than pick on my daughter? Lydia's mum fumed. Come on, Anne. We need to get to the hospital. Anne's mum took her daughter firmly by the hand and led her quickly away. The crowd around them began to disperse. Lydia, her mum and Danny all stood still, watching everyone else walk from them. Lydia, what happened? Lydia's mum was still watching the crowd meander back to their cars in the supermarket. Nothing, Lydia mumbled. But that's not true, is it? Said Lydia's mum, looking at her for the first time. If it was, Frankie wouldn't be on her way to the hospital now. I didn't do that, Lydia said, aghast. I never said you did. I never even thought that. But I'd like to know what happened. Frankie she wanted to talk to me, but I didn't want to talk to her. She slipped on some ice and fell in front of a car, Lydia said. Ice? There's ice here, Mum. Danny tentatively slid his trainer along a patch of ice on the ground. So why is Anne accusing you of pushing her? Asked Lydia's mum, looking for Danny's up to Lydia. Because she's a real skunk, Lydia replied bitterly. That's enough, Lydia, her mum said sternly. Tell me why Anne is saying that you deliberately hurt Frankie. I didn't push Frankie. I was reaching out my hand to try and stop her from falling, Lydia said. Frankie knows I didn't push her. Frankie's unconscious, Lydia's mum pointed out, and Lydia had no answer to that. Mum, can we go home now? Danny asked. Mum sighed. Yes, I think we better. Can't we go to the hospital? Asked Lydia. Don't think that would be the best idea, said Lydia's mum. I'll phone the hospital later to find out how Frankie's doing. But, no buts, Lydia. I think we've all had more than enough for one day. It's going to be a nightmare on wheels as it is, trying to get this car out of this car park with one of the exits locked. Mum looked down at Lydia. Frankie will be all right, I'm sure she will, she added softly. Lydia didn't answer. She couldn't. Without another word, Lydia's mum led the way back to the car. Lydia didn't see the car park, nor the people looking and pointing at her. All she could see was Frankie falling backwards and being hit by the car and spinning around and around. She closed her eyes, but it didn't help. The image was even clearer now. I hate this place. I wish we'd never come here. I wish I'd never even heard of it, Danny said, once they were in the car. Mum turned to look at him. I'm beginning to feel the same way. Lydia leaned her head against the window. That was it then. She had felt that somehow, if everything else continued as normal, then maybe some of it would rub off on her. Her life would get back to normal too. But now, for the first time, she realised that it just wasn't her life being messed up. She was ruining the lives of her whole family. And in that moment, the despair that Lydia felt tightened into a knot around the last piece of hope left inside of her. A knot so tight that any hope left within her was strangled. It didn't matter what happened now. Things would never get back to normal. They would never be the same. Ever.